Thank you. So I'm the guy who makes the films, but I have nothing to show you. I'm terribly sorry about that. I would have talked about the third film that I'm making, and then maybe I can say a little bit about it momentarily. But I want to begin by saying something about the concept of landscape. And I do so by just reflecting for a moment as follows. So some years ago, in fact, many years ago, our faculty hosted a speaker who reported on her latest research on immigrants, immigration, and the broader questions of home and belonging in Metro Toronto. Interview extracts from an earlier study were compared with interview data extracts taken from different people, but of the same demographic, a decade and more later. The major finding was that respondents, more than a decade later, responded in exactly the same way as respondents had responded a decade and more earlier. The conclusion was, therefore, nothing had changed. The conclusion was nothing had changed, and alienation remained a consistent problem. The question that I did not raise at the time was not whether or not alienation was the major persisting problem and that nothing had changed. Rather, the problem seemed to be that the questions themselves had not changed and that the answers were, of course, simply shaped by the questions that we ask. Similarly, I think the landscape in education that we're thinking about is in large measure a result of the kinds of questions we ask and the kinds of theories and thinking that we take to our reflections upon the landscape. So it's not that pre-existing thing out there, it is what we make of it through the kinds of questions and discourses to which we bring to our engagement with what we then perceive to be there. So in my own efforts to think about the changing landscapes, I think about the way I've been trying to change the lens and experimenting with the lens through which I view that landscape. And in Elusive Culture, the primary lens was the one accorded by what I would perhaps caricature as multiculturalism. And I've been in recent years not throwing multiculturalism out in a sense of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That's always such a terrible thing. I mean, it's like killing two birds with one stone. But I don't know any equivalents. So they're terribly vicious metaphors, but they're ones with which we're familiar. So by returning to cosmopolitanism, and it is a return, but my return is in keeping with a huge growth of interest in this literature and this research in recent time. So I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Multiculturalism, as Uri Beck describes, makes permanent the miracle in which dog, cat, and mouse eat from the same place. The individual is the product of the language, the traditions, the convictions, the customs, and the landscapes in which she, he, or he came into the world and in which he or she grew up. So this homeland is regarded as a closed, self-sufficient, and sacrosanct unity which must be protected against every threat. The individual, accordingly, is the epiphenomenon of culture. Cosmopolitanisms work the other way around, and it presupposes some kind of individuation. So more attention is then given to practices and becomings in relation to the kinds of tolerations and habitation accorded by multiculturalism. Citizens are making connections to form always temporary and partial assemblages. The idea of a net and the rhizome, then, as different from the root, R-O-T-T, becomes a guiding metaphor for me. So cosmopolitanism emerges not as a pre-existing entity for which we then can tick the box to see whether one qualifies as a cosmopolitan or not, but we find it in the everyday practices. in which we are involved. Now, one of the implications of working with and thinking about cosmopolitanism for me is the return to the humanities and aesthetics. So my efforts in this regard are traceable in what I write about as the elusiveness of culture or elusive culture, wherein my respondents show me to think about identity more as metaphors, as stories and performances, in which they are not reenacting some kind of pre-existing identity, but they call attention to the ideas, the fantasies, the sensibilities of becomings and connections. So in the work, rivers, coconuts, video games, lyrics, dress codes, etc., replace the data collection envisaged in the earlier study to which I referred at the very beginning, in which nothing has changed. So the students themselves provide the objects to think with, and sometimes with surprising results, such that, for example, the alienation that is lamented, as in the reference I made at the beginning, and the estrangement that might also be associated with that, can emerge not as pathological, but as productive, and not simply, as I said, lamentable. So estrangement in cosmopolitanism differs from the orientation towards immersion in one's culture, coded by multiculturalism, and is this estrangement from one's culture that allows oneself to stand outside it and look in at it. And I want to suggest that's, if not more important, certainly as important as orientating a curriculum around a landscape that is premised more upon this the model of cultural pluralism, where we talk about my culture, your culture, and other people's cultures. Now this work on working with metaphors is what I work with in my films, the 3 films on the trilogy. So I had a heading here, ships and sea as metaphor, and another heading, plants, gardens, and jazz as metaphor. We can talk about that some other time.